My purpose in doing this video is to describe themes I think apply to pretty much every single Stanley Cup playoff series matchup. This is regardless of who the teams are, where they're coming from, what their seeds are, which one's the favorite, which one's the underdog. These are themes that apply to every single matchup in the past and moving forward in a best-of-7 series. I've covered the Sharks now for 10 different seasons. I've obviously watched them for much more than that, but I've worked about 20 different playoff series, and pretty soon it's going to be 120 different Stanley Cup playoff games. I've seen them all from rounds 1 through rounds 4. Now, I haven't seen everything, right? Like every possible scenario and circumstance, but I feel like I've seen enough to make these proclamations, which I think do apply. And just to be clear, what I'm describing here is a best-of-7 series. One team has home ice advantage, so it's 2-2. 1-1-1. As long as that is this playoff format, I think what I'm about to say applies to every game on an individual basis. Let's begin with Game 1, where I think the theme is that questions are answered and some storylines are introduced. There's always a gap between when we know what the matchup is and when the series starts. Whether that's round 1 from the regular season to the playoffs or between rounds, let's just say that one team finishes a couple days earlier with their prior opponent. All the talk, all the chatter about who's favored, the matchups, expectations, all of that stuff is built up. But now finally with Game 1, we start to get some answers. There are some early trends, which of course you're going to notice in the first 60 minutes of this brand new matchup. Those trends are worth noticing, but they're not worth obsessing about yet. One of the storylines I was talking about that unfolds is injury information, right? Because for a handful of days, usually going into a series, you're not going to get much about individual statuses of players, but obviously Game 1, there's no more secrets. You have to show your hand. If players are healthy, they're going to be in there. I also want to add that no series is ever won or lost alone with the result of Game 1. I know it's early. I know it feels good to see your team up with a 1-0 series lead. It doesn't mean much. Let's move on to Game 2s. I always feel like these are potential early turning points in a series. Not the ultimate turning point, but a potential early turning point in a best-of-7 series. Yeah, there's only two different results here, 2-0 and 1-1. And yes, they are different. Hence why the road team, if they're able to get a first victory, they're going to press for a second one, right? They'd like to go back to their rink with a split. Obviously, the same applies to the home team. If they were able to get the victory in Game 1, they want to get greedy and try and get both of these before the series changes locations. I feel like this is a true get greedy game for both sides, right? Because you're only adding to what you already have if you have it. On the other side, you've got to at least get a split because you can't go down 0-2, regardless if you're the home team or the visiting team for these first two games. Game 3s are all about the new scenery, right? The lower seed is finally going to get that home ice advantage, which should benefit them in terms of the crowd, in terms of face-offs, in terms of having last change and being able to dictate matchups, right? This is the chance for the lower seed to make their potential push. Whether the series was tied going into this game, whether they're down 0-2, or whether they have a 2-0 series lead, this is the opportunity for the lower seed to get their advantage in the best-of-7. You also think about 3 as an odd number, meaning that somebody is definitely going to have a series lead at this point. Yeah, 3-0 would be pretty commanding in terms of this matchup, but 2-1, right? That's more common what it is. 2-1 also is a first time where momentum exists in a series because the next win, if the team with 2 gets it, they're going to put the opposition facing elimination early and for the first time. So 2-1 is definitely a turning point. I have always said that the results of Game 4s are the most important in any best-of-7 Stanley Cup playoff series. Not just because through 4 games, you're now more than halfway if this series were to go the maximum of 7 games, but there's only 3 different possible results that come from a Game 4, and all of them have very different but telling stories about where this series stands. Think about 4-0. Pretty one-sided. That was a sweep. One team definitely wasn't even in this matchup. This series is now over. 3-1 is also an interesting situation because, like I said before, now one team is facing elimination for the first time. And by the way, that team has only won one of the 4 matchups so far, so it's not feeling like things are going in their favor. 3-1 is pretty decisive. 2-2 is the most interesting result of a Game 4 because it means now everything starts from scratch. What started out as a best-of-7 series might have at some point turned into a best-of-5, but now with 3 games left, it's a short series. It's only a best-of-3. The home team that began this series gets home ice advantage, and things are going to start getting hectic pretty quick when you think about travel because Game 5, 6, and 7 are not ever in the same location back-to-back. Game 5, for me, is all about the start of that chaos, the back-and-forth travel, because if the series isn't over 4-1 after a Game 5, it's going to be 3-2, and now somebody is obviously facing elimination. It could be for the very first time. And somewhat similar to the results of Game 3, somebody's going to have a series lead. Somebody's going to have momentum. Somebody's going to have that mental edge now that this series finally has a light at the end of the tunnel for one side. This is a turning point game, Game 5. It's a critical one, and unlike Game 3, this is a late one. This is an important one. Game 6 is kind of a simple story for me. You think about going into this one, the lower-seeded team is going to have their last shot at home ice advantage, right? And they don't know if this will be the last game they host for the rest of the playoffs or not, unless it's obviously round 4. Then it definitely is with the Stanley Cup final. So there is that question, right? The home ice crowd of the lower-seeded team doesn't know the future results, but if the higher seed can close out this series, it is imperative they do so. Nobody wants to take it to a 7th game if they don't have to, in terms of the mental fatigue, the physical fatigue you'd be putting yourself through. Obviously, going into a Game 6, somebody's going to have the opportunity to close it out. The question is, can they? Will they? And if they don't, what happens next? And what happens next is that Game 7. And obviously, I can't talk about the results of Game 7 because it decides the series. So instead, I want to talk about the setup of what a game day is like for this dual elimination contest. And it's just the nature of stress and the emotional toll that both sides are now facing. And maybe one team hasn't seen elimination yet, but obviously at this point, one team already has faced elimination to get to a Game 7. Having gone through about 6 or 7 of these from a work perspective, I can tell you not even participating in these games, there's a certain stress factor because you don't know what your life and the team's results and all the prior months you've worked and followed this team, you don't know if they're going to continue being for something or if it's all coming crashing down later that night. That's the stress of a Game 7. As for the contest itself, usually Game 7s start out a bit conservative in the first 10 minutes or even the first period. Nobody wants to jump out and make the mistake that puts their team in a hole. These games are usually played pretty tightly. Both teams, if possible, would probably prefer it that way so that nobody has an aggressive advantage or disadvantage in the first 10 or 20 or even half the game. I guess the only thing to consider with a winner of Game 7 is what did that last series cost them moving forward? Was it an additional injury that a player suffered in Game 7? Was it just more fatigue, unnecessary travel they had to incur by playing that 7th game? You'll only find this out in the next round, but obviously you wouldn't be in that next round had you not gone through a Game 7 and been on the victorious side. I think that the question is what inherent challenges come to the team that just had to play 7 versus a team that might have swept their last round and has been waiting and resting for the next opponent and the next series matchup. I do have to say, one advantage would be this. There is that question of rest versus rust when you have some time off. And I truly believe, as crazy as this sounds, it's easier to keep the wheels moving. It's actually easier to not have big gaps in your playoff schedule as opposed to some consistency and closing down the windows of time between series. All right, so now that we've covered all this, how about a little bonus for you? The recovery process of your team that has been eliminated. And I hate to even suggest this because if you've watched this video this far, you're hyped about your team and the series they might be entering. But If you're on the losing side of a Stanley Cup playoff series, I like to do 1 week for every round your team played in. For example, you're in round 1 and you lose. It should take you a week to get over that result. By get over it, I mean you're not thinking about it on a day-to-day basis. You don't have that sour taste in your mouth. Obviously, you get to round 2 and you don't go on to the Western Conference or Eastern Conference final. Okay, I'll give you 2 weeks to sit there and sulk about it. If you go to the conference final and you don't win, that's a 3-week recovery process. I've been there, I've done that. And if you go to the Stanley Cup final and you're on the wrong side, I will give you a full month to think it over, to sit through it, to mentally have your mind race about all the possibilities and what went right, what didn't go right enough, and obviously what went wrong. I'll give you a full month, and it's a short summer, right? Because you went all the way to mid-June in the Stanley Cup final. You get a full month. You get basically until mid-July to recover, and the good thing is training camps are not far off at that point. Now, if you win the Stanley Cup, you get months and months and years and decades to share that accomplishment, pass it on, and pass it down. I hope you enjoyed these takes about what applies to every best-of-7 Stanley Cup playoff series.